Welcome to the Summit Live, and thank you for joining us. My name is Pamela and I'm the Chief Financial and Corporate Strategy Officer at Payments Canada, and your MC for this event. I'm sure all of us are saddened by the cancellation of not just the Summit Conference, but so many payments events this year. And we want to keep the payments ecosystem and our amazing in-person audience members connected with these webinars. The Summit Series. Once we're reassured that travel and public gatherings are safe again, we'll bring this show on the road to Montreal and Toronto. But in the meantime, we'll use technology we have to connect virtually. Now more than ever in these extraordinary times, it's important to stay connected, keep challenging ourselves, and keep our sights on the future of payments. Today's webinar is all about that, connecting, learning, and challenging ourselves to innovate and provide solutions. We would like to make this webinar as interactive as possible, so we encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A box on your screen. We'll try to get to all of your questions today, but if that's not possible, we'll follow up on our social channels, so stay tuned. This has been a very challenging time for so many of us, so many people and organizations, but there have also been some great success stories and stories of collaborating in crisis to deliver value. It's been incredible to read and be involved in so many positive payments initiatives coming out of this crisis. So today, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, and we're really happy to have them. Robert Hyde is the president of Payment Source, a small business in Canada focused on innovation for payments for the underbanked. And our own Andrew McFarlane as our executive director of Modernization here at Payments Canada. Welcome to you both. We're going to start off today with Andrew. Hi, Robert. Throughout this pandemic, we found new ways to deliver value to Canadians and at the same time, keep the modernization project in motion. To tell you more about this, welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Pamela. It's certainly great to be here and delighted to share in this webinar series. I think, as you said, it's tremendously difficult having to cancel the summit this year, but finding different ways to reach out to our members of the ecosystem, certainly fabulous. So great to be here today.
Thanks, Andrew. So let's talk about transformation during a crisis. What have the past 3 months been like, and how has this global pandemic impacted the future of modernization?
Thanks, Pamela. Certainly taking over as ED of Modernization during this time has really been quite a strange time to take over. I took over in March of this year, and really the challenge of balancing our desire to move forward with our modernization agenda, as well as trying to balance the needs of our members with the challenges of their resources being diverted onto COVID-related activities. So that was particularly a difficult time, but we've certainly come to good compromise with the industry on that. Obviously, from a global pandemic point of view, it's really the impetus around balancing our safety and security of our systems, and also making sure that we can meet the needs of the ecosystem participants. And I think we've really been focused on the scope of the situation and looking at how, as an organisation, how can Payments Canada help specifically? I think it's important to remind people in regards to what we do from a Payments Canada perspective. We operate the critical payments infrastructure for the country, but also we play a role of connecting the ecosystem. And I think that's been the critical part of looking at how we can link up businesses with governments, with the FIs and the non-FIs. So I think on that theme of helping, if we look at what we did recently, certainly with regards to the government benefit payments, we took the pulse of our regulators. We understood the critical importance of speed, of funds, and certainly getting these critical emergency payments out to consumers and also to businesses. We connected some of the key industry organisations. We worked very closely with the Canadian Bankers Association. We worked with CBA, with finance, with the CRA and the Bank of Canada. And we helped deliver something that was desperately needed, which was financial aid. And really our role was around facilitation. It was acting as the convener of those groups and bringing those departments together in order to get the CERB, the CEWS, and the student benefit out to the people that needed it. So from a results point of view, we certainly find and felt that given that we had the foundational capabilities, we had certainly great relationships with our members. We knew the payments data points, and also terrific relationships with the regulators, we were able to change those payment methods very quickly, which resulted in 2.5 million Canadians signing up for direct deposit. As a result, then eliminating the need for checks to come through the mail. So, we certainly feel very proud of the work we did with CBA, CRA, Department of Finance, Bank of Canada, etc. And then the tremendous ecosystem that we work in terms of the industry collaboration that we had. We had banks getting functionality to market within 5 to 6 days, which was just tremendous, and really benefited in over 33 million government payments being made in a fast and effective way. So for us, Pamela, certainly an example of payments modernization at its finest. But I think really, as we were working through that emergency payment activity, we were still focused on our payments modernization and really looking at how does Payments Canada with the ecosystem look to modernize, and how do we make sure that our critical infrastructure is fit for purpose as we move through. Modernization doesn't stop even though there is a global pandemic. So we're actively focused on our links or LVTS system and looking at the replacement of the current large value payment system. We're focused on the batch, on the ACSS, and we're also focused on bringing the new real-time rail to the country for Canada, specifically focusing on the richer data that we will see travel with the payment and the ability to certainly have faster transactions and safer transactions. And we really feel that that's going to be a critical piece. And we're working with our members to drive that forward. And we're certainly making sure that even in these challenging times, we can move the modernisation agenda forward. Just finally, Pamela, just to answer your first question, we're really looking at how do we collaborate and how do we continue to collaborate to deliver value. There's no doubt that this pandemic has certainly tested our speed. It's tested our agility. We certainly feel there are a lot more opportunities that we're going to be very welcome to challenge and to tackle with our members.
Oh, you cut out there for just a second, Anders. So I'm going to continue on. I think
the broader ecosystem, and particularly our stakeholders as we move into the future.
Perfect. Thank you. That certainly was an impact. With just a little hitch on the end there. That's okay. Technical issues are
I'm
part
back
of
in business.
Yeah, we're back in business, so that's fantastic. So lots of stuff that you had to talk about there, and a lot of accomplishments in a very short period and challenging period of time. But let's talk more about collaboration and opportunities. Where do you see the biggest opportunities for small business with modernization?
I think for small businesses, there's still a lot happening within the ecosystem. There's no question of that. We're looking at expanded access for our members. We're looking at consumer-directed finance and what shape that takes within the Canadian economy as we move through this year. I think we look at the fintechs and the paytechs and the rich ecosystem that we have within Canada. The ability for collaboration and innovation is certainly critical. And that's not just a Canadian thing. We're certainly seeing that on a global basis. But we certainly feel that there is a very rich paytech and fintech theme in Canada. And we certainly feel that that provides great opportunities for small businesses. I think the other thing that we've been very keen to look at is really the examples of how businesses have evolved as we've moved through the crisis. That ability to rethink a business model, that ability to look at the challenges of where your footfall has fallen to zero, and how a company is going to adapt their business models to ensure that they can stay in business. How do they act digitally, and how do they move to that in an extremely short period of time? So we've seen small businesses innovate. We've seen small businesses respond to market needs. And we know undoubtedly they're smart. They can mobilize quickly, they can mobilize that technology, and they can cope with the changes. We put out a survey in May from a Payments Canada perspective. Since COVID's arrived, 62% of Canadians are using less cash. And importantly, 42% of customers will avoid businesses that don't accept contactless payments. So it's that ability to evolve and that ability to shift thinking has really been critical. So what does it say to small businesses? We certainly feel, Pamela, there are opportunities to capitalize on this movement. We feel that some of these changes that companies are seeing are going to be lasting changes. They're not changes that are going to take place just for the pandemic and things will go back to the new normal. We certainly feel that these are going to be ongoing changes. Unfortunately, I think from a small business perspective, we're also going to see some small businesses that certainly don't survive as a result of that. We are going into certainly a significant economic downturn. But I think what we can do from a Payments Canada point of view is look at how do we continue to connect the ecosystem? How do we make sure that we are that important link? And how do we do things intentionally to continue that connection of businesses, of corporates, of customers and banks and the regulators? Unfortunately, our summit event didn't happen this year, which was a tremendous networking opportunity. But we certainly feel that, with the webinar series, we've got a great opportunity to get our message out to market. And I think finally, Pamela, just, when I'm thinking about small businesses, is modernisation, our Payments Canada modernisation, going to create efficiencies for companies? I think there's no doubt about that. I think we're going to see time savings for small business customers. We're going to see a shift, certainly in some of their behaviours, the opportunities to create and innovate. And we certainly think in that space of overlay services. We think of the new technologies that companies can use, the new partnerships that they're actively forming, and how do they use the faster, safer and friction-free payments that we certainly feel is going to be made possible really as a result of the greater data and the greater data payloads that are going to travel with the payment, which we think is going to be a significant time saving for our small business customers. The ability to avoid that huge reconciliation effort and the ability to understand the cash flow coming into their account is going to be critical. So we certainly feel, Pamela, that's the main benefit as far as modernisation, the main opportunity.
Thanks, Andrew. That's fantastic and really helpful. But just very quickly before we moved on to the next section, 2-3 quick bullet points. How do you think small businesses can really get in on these opportunities now? What do you advise? 2 or 3 really quick snappers.
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing from an industry point of view, the big organisations really are embracing this change and innovation. So I think, the small businesses actively involved in that space. How do they certainly make sure that it's cost effective? How do they build strength within their organisation? And I think, the organisations that we didn't see a number of years ago, and picking up on the earlier theme around the paytechs and fintechs, if we look at the paytechs of Canada, the Fintech Growth Syndicate, Finance Montreal's Fintech Station, all of those are doing great work to bring paytechs, fintechs, small businesses together to really establish those connections and certainly bring materiality to the things that they're doing. If we look at the big banks and we look at the innovation hubs and certainly the labs that they're developing, certainly to bolster and boost small business functionality, we certainly feel, Pamela, it's a fantastic time to be involved in payments. And we're certainly very excited to bring Payments Canada modernisation journey to the small business customers.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That's really helpful. So speaking of the small business innovation, I'm going to now ask Rob to come back in for a bit of a group Q&A and to discuss some of the great points that you just made. Welcome back, Rob. Hello again. And so we're going to look at a couple of questions from the audience. Okay, so Rob, as a small business and a leader in providing innovative solutions to the underbanked in Canada, what are your thoughts on Andrew's comments?
Thanks, Pamela. So first of all, in regards to the modernization efforts that Andrew was describing, what's important to me as a fintech and as a small business is, how do we ensure that fintechs are gaining access to this system in a timely way? So I know that things have been kind of delayed and slowed, but we want to keep making sure that we're engaging with Payments Canada and other organizations to make sure that continues to happen, so that we really improve competitiveness and offer innovation into the market. It's very important for small businesses to be able to innovate and come up with new solutions, and innovation is survival in many cases for a small business. Organizations such as Paytechs of Canada that Andrew mentioned, they were largely formed because of a lack of engagement by the government in allowing some of this access, or rather the slow pace of it moving ahead. So, that's important to us, is how do we continue to ensure that that innovation is occurring, that we're moving the ball forward on that. Secondly, as the relationship between a business and a consumer has fundamentally changed, we talk about the decline of cash as an acceptance mechanism. How do we make sure that we're serving all segments of the community? So in particular, how do we ensure that vulnerable citizens or vulnerable consumers aren't getting left behind during this change? There was a recent article by CBC talking about homelessness and how the decline of cash has actually had a huge impact on that, right? And then secondly, even from a small business perspective, how are we providing businesses with capabilities in terms of managing their own cash flow? And payments is directly related to, cash flow and how money moves into a business and moves out of a business, so that we can frankly give them time to buy themselves so that they can pivot or shift their business to accommodate some of these new realities.
Terrific. And Andrew, anything to add to that?
I completely agree with what Rob said. I think it's a question of how do we make sure through the initiatives that we're driving that we consider certainly the needs of the unbanked and the underbanked. And I think that's certainly, again, been a key focus of a lot of the activity we've done with the government in terms of getting the emergency payments out. It's how do we safely and securely deliver those funds to make sure that they can hit the right people and they can get that money as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to actually start with our first question from the audience. I always like these. They're pretty exciting. So question number one, the pandemic has brought on a decline in cash use. How can small businesses who rely on cash, how can they adjust? I know you've started to have a couple of comments. Let's start with you, Andrew. Anything to add on that?
I think it probably comes back to the innovation theme, and it's really around the way that the small businesses have been evolving their business models. We've certainly seen with curbside pickup, we've seen with regards to people delivering funds, but I think we've also seen, Pamela, certainly the rich functionality that we have in terms of a lot of our electronic payments mechanisms today. Certainly if we look at the way Interact act within market, and certainly with their e-transfer functionality, it's extremely easy to transfer cash and transfer money between businesses and individuals, and certainly to send funds to people is quite simple. So I think there's no doubt, Pamela, it's certainly been very tricky for customers and certainly for businesses that used to rely on cash. But I think we've certainly seen an evolution of business models and certainly utilising the existing infrastructure, and then obviously future infrastructure we're going to have is going to be critical for that continued evolution of small businesses.
Terrific. And Rob, your comments.
Yeah, it's an important issue. You look at maybe some restaurants or companies, small businesses like that, where cash has been a key aspect of it, and switching to something like credit card, it sounds simple as, oh, let's offer credit card, but there's a cost to that, and not every business has priced in that cost into their business. And so how are they thinking about the overall cost of managing their payments, and what are the things that they can do to maybe offset some of those costs through automation in the back end, or other types of solutions that would allow them to maybe get into new payment methods or new offerings, and then look for innovation in the market. Companies like ours are innovating and providing solutions specifically to try and handle some of those issues.
Fantastic. So I think we do have time for one more audience question before we move into Rob's segment. And so this one I'm going to target at you first, Andrew. What is the time frame for the rich data accompanying payments that you just spoke about? Andrew?
Oh. Yeah, so Payments Canada is working with our ecosystem partners really to deliver the real-time rail. And it's that critical functionality that we plan to deliver. It's part of our modernization journey. We said we're going to focus on the links on the large value payment system first. And that we're delivering, our first release of that is in August, September 2021. And then following that, we aim to deliver the real-time rail functionality to market. So at the moment, Pamela, we're certainly looking at something around mid-22, specifically for the introduction of the real-time rail. And that will certainly provide that ability to have a rich data flow with the payment. And certainly, we can certainly see the reconciliation and the time-saving benefits that will create for our corporates and also our small businesses within the Canadian economy.
Fantastic. And Rob, any reaction to that timing that Andrew just spoke about in 2022?
We're a small company. We tend to work in weeks and months in our planning and our horizon, which is quite different from what the government or a large bank would think of in their planning horizon. So, we would love it to be as tomorrow. We recognize that it's it is a bit more difficult to move forward, and that things like safety and security are important, and we acknowledge that, and regulation that comes with that is important, and we embrace that as well as an organization. So as fast as we can get it, we're gonna, if we don't, there will be fintechs that will disappear, frankly, and innovation will will also suffer as a result. So we want to make sure that we're moving things as fast as we can.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rob. I couldn't agree more. And in fact, you were very kind and gentle to us on that. So couldn't agree more that we'd like to get it there as quickly and safely as we can. And so much appreciated both your comments. Thank you. So thank you both for the little audience break there where we could answer some of their questions that are coming in. Great questions, great answers. Thanks very much for thinking on the fly. Andrew, we'll see you again for a recap at the end where we'll have time for a few more audience questions and ask you both. But for now, Rob, let's get into your questions and get right into it. So thanks again to Andrew and welcome again to Robert. So let's get right into it. So Payment Source's whole foundation is about financial inclusion. Can you talk about financial inclusion from the particular Canadian lens? What does that mean and what does it look like in Canada for Canadians?
Yeah, great. So first to give a little background about us. So Payment Source provides alternative payment solutions. So for example, we allow individuals to use a credit card or PayPal to make a tax payment. Or alternatively, we allow consumers to use cash to buy something on Amazon or online through e-commerce. So a lot of what we do, whether we distribute gift cards, we provide mobile top-up pins. A lot of those services and products that we offer are meant to be filling needs in the market around consumers that have been neglected or left behind. So inclusion and choice is a huge part of our mandate and something that we see is very important. In regards to financial inclusion in Canada, I would say that a lot of us don't really see it as an issue, right? 97% of Canadians have a bank account. So there's a great penetration of banking services, and there's other jurisdiction or countries like the United States where 10% don't have a bank account. It's much larger, or you get into other places around the world. It's very different, but that doesn't mean that there's not an issue in Canada. So there's a significant portion of the population that isn't using their traditional banking services in a meaningful way, even if they do have a bank account. And so I call that group the underbanked, as opposed to the unbanked. According to Acorn Canada, which did a study a couple of years ago, the underbanked in Canada is around 15%. So that's a significant portion of the Canadian population. And in that same study, they were kind of looking at why is this an issue? Why does it persist? And there's really a few reasons they mentioned. One is, as for-profit companies, financial service providers are looking to provide services to as many Canadians as possible, but they want to do it in a profitable way. And, despite the fact that, the banks have a mandate to kind of serve the entire population, it's very easy for them to target marketing that drives cost reductions for them, whether it's, okay, we're going to move our services from branches into online. It may leave behind certain subgroups, and those people don't necessarily get the same level of service or the facilities that you or I would normally get. Things like minimum balance requirements may restrict services and actually may add additional fees on top of that. We have a saying which is, it's expensive to be poor, right? So how are we making sure that we're providing solutions to those individuals as we move forward? There's also a challenge around geography. We're a very large country, relatively sparsely populated in most parts of the geography, and it's hard for a bank to justify the cost of a branch in all geographies, right? And in the past several years, many branches have closed. And a lot of the closures that have happened have been concentrated in lower income neighborhoods. And research has shown that when the banks leave, the payday lenders come in. and other kind of organizations fill that vacuum, and that is problematic. So we need to find ways of making sure we're servicing these people because they have important needs just like everyone else. I think the third point is, some people get paid differently. So we talk about the decline of cash. Well, there is a significant portion of workers who get paid primarily in cash, and they may not see the value of putting their money into a bank. They may hold that money. They may be buying in stores, right? And before the pandemic, right, they were able to go in and shop and buy things, in all the stores and just use cash. So that wasn't really a problem for them. I think the pandemic has shone a bit of a spotlight on inclusion in a number of ways. First, I heard a stat from one of the CEOs of the big five banks that approximately 35% of their branches closed during the pandemic, and that even more interestingly, many of those won't ever reopen. So we're going to see further consolidation into a digital world, which for the majority of us is great, but it leaves behind a real set of consumers. So if you are struggling with being online and doing online banking, that's even just gotten harder for you now. Will it force some and get some over the hump? Absolutely, which is great, but that still doesn't mean that others won't get left behind. The other thing I think about is e-commerce. So we've seen it with the pandemic. E-commerce adoption has probably leapt about 5 years ahead, right? So in terms of adoption of shopping online and being comfortable with that, that's been great. But you're moving from a retail brick and mortar environment where you maybe have cash as a method of payment, you have debit cards as a method of payment, tap, and you have credit card as a method of payment. When you go to e-commerce, primarily you have one method of payment, and that's credit card. So now you're actually reducing the methods of payment available to people, and that has going to impact certain people more than others. Not everyone has credit card, not everyone has access to use that. So how do those people shop online, right? How do we move them along with us? So I think the pandemic has shone a bit of a light on this, and hopefully it's from a policy maker perspective, it's got people thinking about this as an issue and how are we making sure that things are moving ahead. And then finally, on the business side, businesses that have normally relied on cash or even checks, what happens when there's no one in the office to process the check, right? How do you move digitally as a company into that world if you've primarily been a check user, and check use in businesses is still very high, right? We talk about, oh, isn't it great that consumers have kind of moved away from checks, which is very true. But if you go into the business world, especially the small business world, checks are still a heavy part of that world. And so, how do we look at ways of reducing that impact and innovating quickly for those types of individuals or businesses?
Yeah, thanks. And totally right. And couldn't agree more. It's a great business case for a real-time system that's coming out, because then more businesses will then avail themselves of being able to do this electronically instead of checks. And that's fantastic. But you were talking quite a bit about the effects of the pandemic, and certainly the need to get financial aid to Canadians has never been greater. But government system assistance, like the CURB or CERB, depending on how you pronounce your acronym, they won't last forever, those benefits. So what opportunities exist now for small businesses to innovate and collaborate together?
Yeah, financial aid definitely won't last. First off, kudos to Payments Canada and the banks around being able to get through that disbursement of money very quickly. I think that was a good accomplishment. So that's great. But the aid won't last, and businesses to a certain extent need to get on with controlling their own destiny. And they need to chart and find their own path out of the crisis. And so you mentioned collaboration, and I think collaboration to me has always been a very important driver of innovation. And the reason for that is it allows a company to test and validate an idea in a very cost-effective manner and do so in a way that's much quicker to market, right? So I'll give you an example from our world. You know, we recently partnered with PayBright. PayBright offers installment payments. You know, most people think of installment payments as you buy, you know, a piece of furniture and you want to pay it over 3 months or 6 months. So we recently partnered with PayBright to offer installment payments for consumers who are making tax payments. So if you want to be able to spread out your tax payment in a way, we can provide a mechanism to do that, or whether it's your income taxes or whether it's your property taxes even. So lots of different ways to help people manage cash flow in a time when they really need it, right? And we were able to launch and test this idea in weeks. So if we had gone through a process of trying to think through the whole thing ourselves, build the whole thing ourselves, it would have taken months, maybe years to do. But collaboration, working with other partners, has allowed us to get this out, test the idea, and quickly adjust it or pivot it as we see it working, and do this in the middle of a crisis, right? So I think that's a great example of collaboration. Another example that I'll talk about is there's a company, Stack, great little company, and we've you know, in disclosure, we've done work with them in the past, but they recently got acquired by Credit Sesame, and you know, they're really innovating in some very interesting ways. They're collaborating together. Before the purchase, they were collaborating, you know, quite heavily with Credit Sesame to take AI concepts, artificial intelligence, and integrate that into banking and spending so that you can encourage people to do more good behaviors. And by doing good behaviors like financial kind of prudent, healthy behaviors, they can rebuild credit. So someone who may have been credit challenged can now use tools like this to actually help walk them out of you know, those credit challenges and rebuild it. So each of those organizations really brought some unique capabilities to the table. And through that collaboration, they created something entirely different, right? Which is, and they did so in a very fast and quick way. Even big organizations like the banks need to collaborate too. So this isn't just a small business thing. You know, fintechs like ours, for example, we deliver last mile solutions. So we often take and consume things that the banks are doing, you know, whether it's a bill payment, e-transfers, and we find ways of delivering unique custom last mile problems that they would not normally be able to deliver, either because it's too small of a market for the bank to worry about, or they can't deliver it fast enough where we can do that in a really quick, fast time to market way. So I think collaboration is definitely a path that small businesses need to think about as they make their way out of this crisis.
Fantastic, thank you. And so when you talked about some really cool and innovative things that are happening right now. We tend to think, though, often, I mean, it's just typical. We think of products and solutions for consumers because we use them as individuals, but we don't talk that much about creating operational efficiencies. But thinking about both, what do you think the biggest impact is to small business, and how can they manage through this? I mean, that's the reality we're in right now.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think transforming the back office of your company is very important. It's super important, you know, and specifically what I think about in this time is cash flow, right? So cash flow and the movement of money through a business has never been more important, right? And that's really in two ways. One is the inflow of money. So how are you receiving payments from your customers? What is your receivables look like? And what methods of payment do you offer? Do you offer enough? Are you finding ways to shorten your receivable time to get money in quicker? That's super important. And you know, if you process checks, how do you do that, right? You know, even us as a fintech company, when we went into this pandemic, we realized there's a bunch of things we still did especially in the kind of accounting part of our business, that we're still, heavily reliant on paper. And we had to kind of digitize that and do that really quickly because everyone left the office. So
that's right.
Yeah, it went away. And so that became really important. Remittance information, right? So there's a lot of things like an EFT or an e-transfer. They can come into a business, but there's not a lot of remittance information that goes with that. So, how do you provide additional solutions that may solve those problems? And then on the outflow side, how do they pay for things? So how does a small business actually make payments for their inventory, for expenses, for salaries, rent, all these types of things? For example, payment on of of expenses on credit card can often improve cash flow, right? You get another 30 to 40 days of cash flow just by putting something on a credit card. But small businesses typically only flow about 20% of their expenses through credit card, right? And that's not for lack of wanting the ability to do that. It's lack of acceptance on, you can't generally pay your rent using a credit card unless you're using some fintech services that are out there. Salaries, you don't put salaries on your credit card. So those types of things become hard to pay. So, that's why, for example, one of the things that we do, we have a Pay Simply platform, which allows small businesses to pay for tax payments and stuff using their credit card, and that actually gives them some cash flow time, right? So if they need, if they're just trying to get through this and survive, and they just need a little bit more cash flow to manage the business through that, that's important. And good innovative companies understand the cadence of that flow of money through their business, both from the money in and money out. And they think about working capital and how they are managing that. And if they're good, they do that really well. And that gives them a leg up or an edge and a better chance of survival in these times.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, even for our own business, the money in, money out, and the working capital is really important. And as people start talking about cash flow, I'd like to change the use of the word, because we are reducing cash. And in fact, it's not cash, but it's liquidity management and working capital management. And so you're totally singing my song with talking about cash and back office. So thanks very much for that. And building on that then, and all of the innovation that you're seeing and that indeed you're doing in your business, what do you see as the future for small business in Canada?
So I personally remain very bullish on small business and our ability to figure our way out of it. Justin Trudeau yesterday said that the pandemic has opened up opportunities to rethink and reshape our community, right? So whether he's talking about things like long-term care and those things, which are absolutely very important, it's also allowed us to think about how we interact, how we do business, and what things we've taken for granted and what things that we've maybe dragged our heels on a little bit, and we can move forward. So when I look at my organization, I can't speak for every small business out there, but I think about how do we really become agile as an organization, which means rapidly figuring out what works and what doesn't work, and being able to pivot and move through that experiment very quickly is very important for us. So how do we become really agile to be able to find our way through it? Back to the partnership and collaboration. How are we looking for partnerships and opportunities to collaborate, right? As this really allows us to leverage limited resources. We only have so many resources. As a small company, we can't throw millions or billions of dollars at an idea. We have to do it really on the cheap, and we have to think about how we deliver it and bootstrap it, frankly. And so if we can find partners or others in the market that can help leverage and scale, that becomes really important for us. And then I think the third kind of pillar of that is advocacy, right? So having a voice, telling the industry what we need to be successful, telling the government what we need to be successful, both in Canada and globally, is really important. So, for example, we're one of the founding members of Paytex of Canada, and that organization has been absolutely essential in ensuring that small fintechs like us have a seat at the table when it comes to policy, right? So that's how, we know the Payments Canada folks, and we engage with that, and the Paytex Association has been a huge advocate of us and a voice for all of us collectively to move that forward, specifically in consumer-directed finance. So please, let's make that happen.
Yeah.
And the retail payments oversight stuff, that's really important for us.
Couldn't agree more. I'm gonna add an extra question that we didn't discuss in advance, just to keep you on your toes. You talked and we talked a lot about the importance of collaboration and partnerships. Now, you just mentioned Paytex of Canada as a way of ensuring advocacy and your voice and a seat at the table. What are other methods or channels that you use to reach out and find partnerships? What do you find works for small businesses and perhaps some of those listening, watching today?
So I think very carefully about where as an organization we operate and what is the ecosystem that we exist in. And then the process for me is, understanding that ecosystem, so being very engaged in it. It's a big part of my job as the president, is to remain highly engaged in the ecosystem. And by understanding where the ecosystem is going and who's coming out with ideas and engagement in the market, that allows me to find those new partners. Partners often exist in suppliers, right? Like, I would consider our bank to be a great partner of ours. They provide our banking services, but they also provide some actual core fundamental services that we are building on top of, as I mentioned about delivering last mile solutions. So it's really important. I miss the summit because we see that as a kind of a key milestone in our kind of annual cycle of engaging with the community. And so doing things like this is definitely helpful, but really want the summit to come back as soon as it can.
So do we. So we thank you for that plug, and that was not paid sponsorship, by the way, but
No.
We really miss the opportunity to interact with people too. So this is great, but it's not quite as good as that experience. Thanks so much, Rob. I really appreciate your comments. Now let's invite Andrew back now for a bit of a group discussion and take some more of your audience questions. So come on back, there he is. Welcome back, Andrew. And let's start with your thoughts on Rob's comments. Anything, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I thought they were really insightful comments. And I think if we think about the check reduction piece that certainly Payments Canada, the regulators and the ecosystem are actively driving at this point in time, we're starting with government check reduction. And I think Rob made a really interesting point when you look at bank branches and certainly temporary closures or permanent closures as a result of COVID. And certainly we've been thinking about the inefficiency of the check and that ability or that need to get the check posted out to someone. They have to then go and physically do something with that check. So we've been very strong on looking at how do we boost those direct deposit rates. So I think, Rob's spot on. I think we're going to see continued challenges, continued changes within that. And I think that's something that Payments Canada is really actively going to drive and facilitate with the ecosystem and with our partners at PSPC and the like. I think the other thing that Rob spoke about was the policy consultation and the importance of consultation within the ecosystem. So we'll be out shortly for a public consultation on the real-time rail. I think it's going to be very important that we get the feedback. Certainly, we've been working very collaboratively with our members to certainly understand the policies that we're going to put into market. And we certainly want to get the feedback from the public as well. We need to make sure that we get the Paytex and FinTech's views, that it's critical that we can move through that relatively quickly so we can get to market by that mid-22 position. So wholly agree with the stuff that Rob was talking about and certainly echo a lot of his sentiments.
Thanks very much, Andrew. So now it's time for yet another audience question. So thanks very much. Keep them coming. And building exactly on the topics we just discussed. Rob, I'm gonna start with you here. So what do you think drove or drives such high check usage during or pre-pandemic, And how will that change post-pandemic, or where we are now, the new normal, whatever that is, but pre-real-time rail, so that May 2022 date that Andrew was just talking about? Your thoughts, Ron?
I think a lot of the check, especially in the small business world, is driven by the fact that a lot of small businesses are effectively run on paper. There's a lot of a paper invoice is provided to somebody, a check is received, it's stapled to the invoice, it's filed in a folder. The remittance data that goes with that becomes really key. It's hard when you get an e-transfer. It's just from Bob. Bob sent you an e-transfer. It's not always easy to say this is for invoice 123, or I'm applying this to, $200 to this invoice and $300 to another invoice. It's just a lump sum of money that comes in, and so matching that can become difficult. And checks, for all their flaws, there's a little memo field that you can write in there and say invoice 123 and that sort of thing. So I think those back office processes and the lack of automation in the back office has been a huge barrier to reducing checks and getting them out of the system. And then I think also, checks can be used as a cash flow mechanism as well, in terms of, putting the check in the mail. How do you send it out there and get an extra 7 days as it moves through the mail to manage your cash flow. So I think there's a couple reasons why it's been staying in there. I think, as you move people out of the office, as we've gotten into remote work, it's forced the back offices to go a lot more digital. And so I think that post-pandemic, a lot of that automation that was forced upon companies will stay.
Right.
That being said, some will continue to use checks. It's going to be a sticky thing. It's not something that we can just flick a switch with one new technology and make it go away. Like, I can't think of a single payment method in the history of payments, since the 16th century, that has gone away. They've reduced and they've gone to a very small volume, but cash still exists, checks still exist, and they're going to continue to exist into the future. The best thing that we can do is minimize how much they're used and look for constant new ways of improving upon that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Andrew, your thoughts?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that sentiment. Certainly the convenience of getting that check in the mail, and certainly coming through with the data, and certainly with the data that comes with the check, usually to Rob's point, with the perforation and the details are above the check, and you rip it off and lodge it. But I think, really to Rob's point, we've got to find an alternate. There has to be the alternate solution available. And I think that's where, I know the question was talking about pre-real-time rail, but I'm going to plug the real-time rail anyway. I mean, that's certainly the importance of bringing that to market, and certainly providing, you're not going to see that displacement. You're not going to see a movement unless you've got another option. And I think that's a critical piece that the real-time rail will bring.
Okay, so next question. It's a little bit lengthy one, but actually flowing right along. So the check is in the mail comment that you just made, Rob. So checks offer small businesses a means of messaging cash flow, or messaging and massaging, but massaging cash flow. So the check is in the mail concept. Using a credit card allows this to an extent, but it means that the business may incur interest, which nobody wants, and often it's a reasonably high rate of interest. Is there a way of bringing this free cash flow management capability to the electronic or the card payment space? Rob, why don't we start with you here?
Yeah, this is a challenge for sure, because there's a perception that cash is free or that checks are free, but they're not.
Right.
No payment method is free. The cost of payment is often embedded in the products we buy. So we don't see it. It's not like, oh, we're going to charge you an extra $1 for the payment. You don't see that. So, I think in terms of finding alternatives to that, you're right, credit card is a good alternative, assuming you're paying off your credit card. So I would say you should never use that if you don't believe that will have the money in 30 days, you shouldn't be pushing that money out, because you're just going to make the problem, you're just pushing the problem down the road. Can you look at relationships with suppliers where you're managing that flow of money? So for example, even with a credit card, you may have put a check in the mail. Can you pay earlier with a credit card and get an early pay discount, right? So there's a lot of suppliers that will give, it'll be like, 2% net 10, right? So, we want payment within 10 days of the invoice, but if you pay early, you get a 2% discount on your invoice. So, if you're a small business, looking and understanding that and moving your money, that's why I said people who manage cash flow really well often are a lot more successful, because they understand the importance of that as they're growing and they're scaling their business. So I think, finding ways of still doing it digitally and getting the information you need, but again, having those negotiations or discussions with suppliers to figure out, where are the levers that you have to control and manage your cash flow or your working capital.
Thanks, Robin. And Andrew, thoughts about managing free cash flow for small businesses?
Yeah, I think, Pamela, a key thing that comes to mind for me is friction. And it's really around that friction-free payment that the real-time rail and certainly electronic capabilities will provide. I think, yeah, absolutely, the checks in the mail, that's fantastic. But, the time and effort needed for that. And I think to Rob's point, the cost. And as check volume reduces, certainly the economics of those checks are going to change quite a lot. So it's really a question of how do we make sure that we take the friction out of the payment for the small business customers, and then speed is critical. How do we make sure that that real-time commitment and certainly that transfer of funds into a small business's account? Rob talked about it before, the criticality of cash flow at this point. So the ability to get real-time cash flow into your account is certainly a critical piece. And we feel with options available, that will certainly displace the usage of check.
Okay, fantastic. I think we have, if we make it snappy, we have time for one more audience question. We'll start with you first, Andrew, and just keep the flow going. Can you expand on digital options for check deposits for small business? But can this also help other organizations, for example, governments? And you referenced PSPC and some of the initiatives happening at Payments Canada now as an example.
Yeah, and I think really, as you said, Pamela, it's really looking at the source. And it's really looking at how do we certainly change the source behavior. There's no doubt that certainly with the proliferation of checks within the industry, and as Rob said, particularly on the business side, it's become a way of doing things. And I think really the efficiencies that certainly we can generate by working with the government, working with the ecosystem to change those behaviors. But it's got to be a fundamental behavioral change, and there's got to be something back in that. So I think the digital options will be there in due course. And only once those options are there will we see certainly a continued decline in check usage. We've obviously seen fundamental declines over the last number of months, but we'll see, making sure that those declines stick and we have alternate payment methods are critical.
Yeah, and your thoughts on that, Rob?
Yeah, I think the way I was interpreting this question was around kind of remote deposit capture or tools like that that organizations can use. So most of us have a banking mobile app, and most of those apps now allow you to scan a check or deposit a check without ever going into a branch. So that's definitely moving things forward. But there's still the process of making that check and sending that check and putting it in the mail. So that hasn't really gone away. Definitely, and most large organizations have invested in big scanners and processes where mail comes in and it gets sorted and scanned and all sorts of things like that. Small businesses, there are banking solutions out there. So I think if you're a small business, you can talk to your bank about options for deposit capture for your business. But it still doesn't solve the problem of where does the check go? Who's opening that mail? And how does it get reconciled against the information in your system? And I think so things like there's a new standard, ISO 20022, which is a remittance standard, which will be coming with the real-time rails and all that kind of capability. That stuff is super important. You can't emphasize enough the need for remittance information, the ability to pair it to a payment. With a consumer, it's not as much of an issue, but with businesses, it's absolutely critical. Absolutely critical to have remittance information. So I think, I would say let's keep moving ahead on those initiatives, because I think those start to really solve those problems and then allow us to move away from checks and paper.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. And thank you both so much. I can't believe we've almost run out of time. I'll end by asking you for a final word. So what's one piece of advice you can offer small businesses that will help them innovate? I know we've spent the whole hour essentially talking about that, but Rob, a final word from you first.
So I think innovation comes from going back to first principles, thinking fundamentally about the problems you're trying to solve in the market that you serve, and looking to identify either new problems for your capabilities or solving, or new solutions to solve those problems. I'll use examples again. You look at some of the local distilleries that have, shifted their production to producing hand sanitizer, right? Because there was a market and a huge increased demand for hand sanitizer that existing producers couldn't meet the demand, right? So you see pivots like that. Spin Master, another great toy company, they realized, headbands, I'm not sure if you've ever played the headbands game, but they realized that plastic for the headbands could actually be repurposed to make face shields. And so, they pivoted to solve a new problem. So they took existing capabilities and they solved a new problem. Or, you can look at, how do I take my existing problems and find new ways of solving them, right? So museums, they've shut their doors, but now they're doing digital walking tours, and other things like that. It not only, gives access to the people who would have gone in anyway, but maybe now they can actually reach new consumers or new people that wouldn't normally get a chance to visit that museum, right? So how do they find ways of innovating so that they can get to these new audiences? So to summarize, you first are saying, what are we solving? And you go back to those first principles of what are we actually doing as a business? And then you ask, how do we solve? And then that together, you can really find great innovation.
Thanks for that, Rob. Andrew, final word.
For me, two things. It's all about collaboration. It's all about certainly the small businesses leveraging the fantastic pay tech and fintech bodies that we have within Canada, and how can they certainly work with their banks and the innovation hubs to certainly bring new functionality to market. And then I think secondly, it's for them to continue to play an active interest in the PayCan modernization story, to really look at our timeframes, to understand what's coming to market and understand how they can then benefit from that. And certainly, as Rob said, the ISO 20022 data set that's going to really provide that rich functionality and data with payments. So we're very excited, and we're looking forward to working with our stakeholders and our small business customers as we move through the modernization journey.
Fantastic. Well, Rob, Andrew, thank you both very much for being our guinea pigs, for being part of our first ever Summit Series webinar. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today online. We had great questions coming in, so thank you for that as well, and more questions than time. And so we will follow up with answers shortly on our social channels, so please do follow us. We hope you found this session engaging, and we would like to keep the conversation going for sure. So our next webinar will be held on July 21st, and joining me will be Doug Kreviazuk, the Executive Director of Paytex of Canada that we talked about today already, Sue Britton, the CEO and founder of Toronto's FinTech Growth Syndicate, and Andrew Holliome, our own Senior Director of Payment Products at Payments Canada. Please register for this and all future webinars on the Summit's website, pretty easy, thesummit.ca. A recording of this session will be available shortly, and we'll be following up with everyone who attended today with a post-webinar survey. As it was the first one, everybody was guinea pig on this one. We would really like to hear from you and make sure that we make it better. We recognize that these events are incredibly important right now to keep the audience together, to keep you feeling as part of the ecosystem and the community, and as we navigate through the global pandemic and beyond into the great tomorrow. So thank you so much again for your time. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thank you.